The sun hung in the sky like a hammered copper disc, unforgiving and white-hot, bleaching the color out of the Arizona territory until the world was nothing but shades of dust, dried sage, and blood-red rock. It was late in the 1870s, a time when the edges of the map were still jagged and bleeding, and Clara Hayes sat on the splintered bench of a buckboard wagon, wishing she could simply dissolve into the heat shimmer rising from the earth. Every turn of the wooden wheels sent a jolt up her spine, rattling her teeth. The wagon train was small, only 4 vehicles stringing out like beetles across the vast, empty pan of the desert floor. They were heading toward the Mogollon Rim, toward a ranch that existed only as a terrified abstraction in Clara's mind. She looked at her hands. They were gripping the iron rail of the seat so tightly that the knuckles were white, the skin chafed raw by the grit that permeated everything. She wore a high-collared dress of blue calico that had been stifling when they left Santa Fe and was now a torture device. Sweat trickled down her back, soaking the corset she had been laced into that morning by a stern-faced matron who traveled in the lead wagon. "Keep your chin up, Clara," her mother had told her. "It is a good match, a wealthy match." Clara closed her eyes against the glare, but the darkness behind her lids brought no relief. It only brought the image of Edward Mallory. He was waiting for her at the end of this dusty road, a man 30 years her senior with hands that felt like cold, damp clay, and eyes that assessed her as if she were a broodmare at an auction. The driver of her wagon, a grizzled man named Silas who chewed tobacco with the rhythmic consistency of a metronome, spat a stream of brown juice over the side, hotter than the devil's anvil today. "Miss Hayes," Silas grunted, wiping his mouth with a sleeve stained by grease and road dust. Clara forced a nod. "It is very warm, Silas." She did not tell him that the heat outside was preferable to the cold dread inside her chest. She did not tell him about the night 2 months ago in the parlor back east, when Edward had visited her father to finalize the arrangement. Clara had objected, trembling, citing his temper, the way he spoke to the servants, the rumors of his first wife's misery. Edward had cornered her near the heavy velvet drapes while her parents were in the dining room. He had gripped her upper arm, his fingers digging in hard enough to bruise, his face close enough that she could smell the brandy and stale cigars on his breath. "You will learn to be agreeable, Clara," he had whispered, his voice smooth and devoid of affection. "I have paid a great deal for you, and I expect a return on my investment. Tears are unattractive, my dear. Dry them, or I will give you something real to cry about." She had frozen then, just as she sat frozen now. The landscape rolling past was alien and hostile. To her left, a mesa rose up like a fortress of red stone, its flat top scouring the clouds. To the right, endless scrubland stretched toward purple mountains that looked like bruises on the horizon. Dust devils spun across the dry arroyos, dancing pillars of earth that rose and fell with the whims of the wind. High above, black vultures circled in lazy, patient loops, waiting for something to die. Water was low. They had been rationing it for 2 days. Clara licked her cracked lips, tasting salt and iron. She felt small here. In the east, nature was manicured, contained in gardens and parks. Here, nature was a beast that wanted to kill you. Silas pulled on the reins as the wagon dipped into a wide, dry wash, the wheels grinding in loose sand. The horses blew hard, their flanks lathered with foam. "We will stop near the cottonwoods up ahead," Silas called out to the wagon in front. "Give the teams a rest before we climb the ridge." The wagons shuddered to a halt in the partial shade of a few gnarled trees that clung to the bank of the dry riverbed. The silence that followed was heavy. It was not a peaceful silence. It was a holding of breath. The cicadas buzzed in a rising, feverish pitch that sounded like electricity. Clara climbed down, her legs shaking from hours of vibration. She smoothed her skirt, the dust rising in a cloud around her boots. She walked toward the back of the wagon to retrieve a canteen, her movements stiff. It happened before the thought could fully form. A crack, sharp and sudden as a whip, split the air. Silas jerked backward against the wagon wheel. a red flower blooming instantly on his dusty shirt. He looked down at it, confused, before sliding sideways into the dirt. Then the world exploded. Screams erupted from the lead wagon. Horses screamed louder than the people, a high, terrifying sound that tore at Clara's eardrums. Gunfire crackled from the ridge above, a chaotic popping like firecrackers, but deadly real. Dust kicked up everywhere, obscuring the sun, turning the afternoon into a choking gray twilight. Clara stood paralyzed. Her mind could not process the shift from boredom to carnage. She saw figures descending the slope, men on horseback, yelling, firing pistols and rifles. Some wore the wide sombreros of bandits. Others wore headbands and buckskin. It was a chaotic mix, a raiding party driven by hunger and opportunity, falling upon them like wolves. "Run!" a voice in her head screamed. "Run, Clara!" But her feet were nailed to the earth. She watched as the matron from the lead wagon was dragged out, shrieking. She watched the driver of the third wagon return fire with a shotgun until he was overwhelmed. A horse slammed into her wagon, knocking Clara to the ground. She gasped, the wind driven from her lungs, the taste of sand filling her mouth. She scrambled backward on her hands and knees, seeking the shelter of the wheels. A hand grabbed her ankle. She kicked out, finding her voice in a ragged scream. "No, let me go!" A man dragged her out from under the buckboard. He was heavy, smelling of stale mezcal and unwashed sweat. A Mexican bandit with rotting teeth and eyes glazed with drink and violence. He laughed, a wet, hacking sound, and pinned her to the ground. His weight was crushing. He fumbled at her skirts, muttering words she did not understand but whose intent was horrifyingly clear. Clara beat at his face with her fists, but it was like hitting a side of beef. He backhanded her, a stinging blow that snapped her head to the side and filled her vision with stars. This is it, she thought, a strange detachment settling over her. This is how I end, not as Edward's wife, but as dust in a dry riverbed. Then, the weight was gone. There was a sickening thud, wet and heavy, and the bandit collapsed sideways, gargling blood. Clara gasped, pushing herself up on her elbows, scrambling away from the dying man. Standing over him was a figure that seemed to have materialized from the smoke and dust. He was Apache. He was tall, lean, and made of corded muscle under bronze skin. He wore high moccasins and a breech clout, his chest bare save for a bone choker. His face was painted with stripes of black and yellow, making his expression unreadable, terrifying. In his hand, he held a knife that dripped crimson. Dasan looked down at the white woman. He saw the terror in her wide, pale eyes, the way her chest heaved, the blue calico torn at the shoulder. He saw a creature that looked soft, useless, terrified. But as he looked at her, the rage that had been burning in his gut for 3 years flared hot and bright. He remembered the blue coats. He remembered the smoke of his own village. He remembered his sister, younger than this woman, dragged into the bushes by laughing soldiers while he lay pinned under a fallen beam, helpless to save her. This woman was one of them. One of the invaders who brought the fences, the sickness, the soldiers. Clara saw him tense, his knuckles white around the handle of the knife. She saw the decision forming in his eyes, the black, pitiless depth of them. He was going to kill her. She braced herself, closing her eyes, refusing to beg. The gunshot from a settling dust cloud near the riverbank pinged off the wagon wheel inches from Dasan's head. He flinched, snapping back to the present. The skirmish was not over. A settler from the last wagon was still firing from behind a dead horse. Dasan grabbed Clara's arm. His grip was iron, far stronger than Edward's. But there was no cruelty in it, only urgency. He hauled her to her feet as if she weighed nothing. "Move," he said, the English word rough and heavily accented. She stumbled, her legs refusing to work. He didn't wait. He swept an arm around her waist and lifted her, swinging her around to the lee side of his horse, a painted pony that stood ground-tied amidst the chaos. He shoved her down between the animal and the wagon wheel. "Stay," he commanded. He turned back to the fight, raising his rifle. Clara huddled against the horse's warm flank, pressing her face into the animal's coarse hair. Trembling so violently, her teeth chattered. She listened to the shouts, the final gunshots, the groans of the dying. It lasted 5 minutes, perhaps 10. To Clara, it was a lifetime. When the silence returned, it was deeper than before. The cicadas had stopped. The only sound was the wind hissing through the cottonwoods and the heavy breathing of the horses. Rough hands pulled her up. It was not the bandit. It was the warrior again. He spun her around, checking her for wounds with an impersonal efficiency. "You walk now," he said. He began to tie her hands. He used a strip of rawhide, binding her wrists in front of her. Not tight enough to cut off the blood, but tight enough that she could not slip free. The other raiders were gathering. The bandits were looting the wagons, ripping open flour sacks, smashing crates of china that had traveled 2,000 miles only to end up as shards in the Arizona dirt. They found a stash of whiskey and cheered. Dasan led Clara toward a group of Apache warriors who stood apart from the Mexicans. They were looking at her with hard, assessing eyes. "Kill her," one of the younger men said in Apache, gesturing with his rifle. "She slows us down. The soldiers will come looking for a white woman." "No," another argued. "Leave her for the buzzards. Let the desert take her." Dasan looked at Clara. She stood amidst the ruin of her life, her face streaked with dust and tears, her dress torn, surrounded by dead men. Yet she was standing. She was not screaming. She was staring back at them, her jaw set in a line of trembling defiance. "She is mine," Dasan said quietly, his voice cutting through the debate. The younger warrior sneered. "For what? To warm your blanket? You have grown soft. Dasan, you have forgotten what they did to Nalin's son, to your own kin." "I forget nothing," Dasan snarled, stepping forward, his hand dropping to the knife at his belt. His eyes were dangerous, filled with a cold fire that made the younger man take a step back. "She is worth rifles. She is worth horses. We trade her back to the Blue Coats, or we ransom her." He lied. He knew he lied. The army did not trade rifles for women anymore. They just sent more soldiers. But he could not kill her. When the bandit had been on top of her, he had seen not a white enemy, but a woman helpless against a brute. He had seen his sister. To let her die now would be to let the brutality of the world win again. "We take her," Dasan said, ending the discussion. He turned to Clara, pointing a long, brown finger at the horizon where the sun was beginning to dip, painting the sky in violent shades of violet and bruised orange. "Walk," he said, "or I drag you." Clara looked at the dead body of Silas. She looked at the smoldering remains of the lead wagon. She looked at the vast, empty desert stretching out before her. She began to walk. The journey was a blur of agony. Clara was not wearing boots meant for the desert. She wore thin leather button-up shoes intended for parlor floors and church aisles. Within the first hour, her heels were blistered. By the second, the blisters had burst, bleeding into her stockings. The Apache did not ride on the road. They cut across the country, moving through dry washes filled with loose stone, up steep embankments of crumbling shale, and through thickets of cat-claw acacia that tore at Clara's skirt and scratched her arms until they burned. She fell often. Each time, she expected a blow. Each time, she merely heard the clip-clop of hooves stopping behind her. She would look up to see Dasan watching her from the back of his paint horse. He offered no hand, no water, no word of encouragement. He simply waited, his face impassive, forcing her to find the strength to stand on her own. "If I stop, I die," she told herself. "If I cry, he wins." Night fell, and with it, the heat vanished, sucked away into the thin atmosphere. The cold was instant and biting. Clara shivered, her teeth rattling. The sky turned into a dome of obsidian, pierced by stars so bright and numerous they looked like spilled salt. They were hard stars, indifferent and distant. Coyotes began to yip in the distance, a manic, laughing sound that made the hair on Clara's arms stand up. She remembered the stories her aunt had told her, stories of Apache torture, of captives buried in anthills, of skins peeled away inch by inch. She looked at the silhouette of the man riding beside her. He looked like part of the landscape, carved from rock and shadow. Was he a monster? He had saved her from the rapist. But was he saving her for something worse? Dasan watched her stumble in the moonlight. He saw the way she hugged her own ribs to stop the shivering. He reached behind his saddle and untied a rough woolen blanket. He tossed it at her. It hit her shoulder with a heavy thud. Clara caught it, surprised. She looked up at him, but he was already looking away, scanning the ridgeline. She wrapped the scratchy wool around her shoulders, the smell of horse and wood smoke enveloping her. It was the most comforting thing she had ever felt. They rode until the moon was high. Finally, they entered a narrow canyon, the walls rising sheer on either side, blocking out the stars. The smell changed. The dry, dusty scent of the open desert gave way to the smell of burning juniper, roasting meat, and human habitation. They rounded a bend, and the camp appeared. It was not a military formation. It was a cluster of wickiups, domed shelters made of brush and hides, tucked against the canyon wall near a trickle of water that seeped from the rock. Dogs ran out to bark at the horses. Clara stiffened. She expected a war camp. She expected drums and torture stakes. Instead, she saw a woman grinding corn on a flat stone. She saw children running between the fires, chasing each other with sticks. She saw an old man sitting by a fire, mending a bridle. It was a village. It was a home. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. These were not faceless monsters living in the void. They were families. Dasan dismounted and pulled Clara toward the central fire. The camp went quiet. Conversation stopped. Eyes turned toward them, dozens of pairs of dark, suspicious eyes reflecting the firelight. Dasan spoke to a gray-haired man who sat on a buffalo robe, the headman. The language was guttural, full of stops and harsh breaths, yet flowing with a strange rhythm. Dasan gestured to Clara, then to the rifles they had taken from the raid. The headman listened, his face a map of deep wrinkles. He looked at Clara, his gaze penetrating but not cruel. He said a few words, waving his hand dismissively. Then, a movement from the side caught Clara's eye. A woman stepped into the firelight. She was older than Dasan, her hair hacked short in mourning, her face gaunt. She wore a sackcloth dress, and her eyes were pits of absolute, scorching hatred. This was Nalin. She walked up to Clara, ignoring Dasan. She stopped inches from Clara's face. Clara could smell the grief on her, a scent like old ashes. Nalin spoke in English, the words broken and sharp as glass. "You bringing death," she hissed. "White woman is death. My son. Boys kill him. White boys. Blue coats." Nalin spat on the ground at Clara's feet. She raised a hand as if to strike, but Dasan stepped between them. He did not touch Nalin, but he lowered his head and spoke softly, respectfully, yet firmly. Nalin glared at him, then looked back at Clara. "You will cry," she promised. "You will cry until dry. Then you die." She turned and stalked away into the darkness. Dasan took Clara's arm and led her away from the main fire, toward a smaller wickiup at the edge of the camp. He cut the bond on her wrists. "Sit," he commanded, pointing to the ground near the entrance. He went inside and returned with a gourd of water and a piece of dried meat that looked like shoe leather. He set them down beside her. "Do not run," he said. "The canyon has eyes. The desert has teeth. You run, you die." He sat down a few yards away, cross-legged, his rifle across his knees. He began to clean the mechanism, the metallic clicks loud in the quiet night. Clara sank to the ground. Her legs finally gave out. She pulled the blanket tighter around her. She took a sip of the water. It was cool and tasted of earth. She tried to eat the meat, but her throat was closed tight with fear. She looked up at the slice of sky visible between the canyon walls. The stars were still there, watching. She thought of her soft bed in the east. She thought of the horrific future that had awaited her with Edward. And she thought of the blood on Silas's shirt. Tears finally came, hot and silent, tracking through the dust on her cheeks. She bit her lip to keep from making a sound. She would not let them hear her. She would not let Nolans see her break. "I am Clara Hayes," she whispered to herself, the words a tiny anchor in a storm. "I am still here." Dasan watched her from the shadows. He saw the tears glisten in the firelight. He saw the way she clenched her jaw, fighting for control. He looked down at his hands. They were stained with gunpowder and dry blood. He rubbed his thumb over the stock of his rifle. He remembered holding his younger brother, Cheveo, 2 winters ago. The boy had been shot in the gut during a retreat. Dasan had held him as the light faded from his eyes, as the snow turned red. He had felt his own heart turn to stone that day, cracking and hardening like the mud of the Badlands in a drought. He looked back at the white woman. She was the enemy. She was the reason his world was ending. But she had fire in her. He had seen it when she looked at the bandit. He saw it now in her refusal to wail. "Why did I save her?" he asked himself. The wind sighed through the canyon, carrying the scent of pine and impending winter. Dasan had no answer. He only knew that for the first time in a long time, the silence inside him was not quite so empty. He leaned his head back against the wiki-up frame and closed his eyes, listening to the woman breathe, waiting for the dawn that would bring no mercy for either of them. The first 3 times Clara tried to escape, the land itself betrayed her. The canyon was not a cage of iron bars, but it was a prison nonetheless, forged from red sandstone and gravity. On the second morning, while the camp was distracted by the butchering of a mule deer, Clara slipped away toward the northern rim. She scrambled up a slope of loose shale, her boots sliding backward 2 feet for every foot she gained. The sun beat down on her neck like a physical weight, a heavy, hot hand pressing her into the dust. She reached for a handhold, a protruding root of a twisty mesquite bush. It snapped. Clara tumbled backward, scraping her arms raw against the unforgiving stone, dust filling her nose and mouth. She landed hard in a patch of cat-claw acacia, the thorns tearing at her skirts and sinking into her skin. She lay there, gasping for breath, the taste of copper in her mouth. When she looked up, Dasan was standing at the bottom of the slope. He was not angry. He did not look like a jailer who had caught a thief. He looked like a man watching a foolish child try to touch a hot stove. "You climb like a crippled lizard," he said. He did not help her up. He turned his back and walked away, leaving her to pick the thorns out of her bleeding palms and limp back to the fire in shame. That was the lesson the desert taught her. There was nowhere to run. Beyond the canyon walls lay 100 miles of waterless hell. Without a horse, without knowledge of the hidden springs. She would be dead in 2 days, dried out like the husks of beetles she found in the sand. So, she stayed, and she worked. Dasan was her shadow. He did not chain her, but his eyes were always on her. He made it clear that if she ate, she worked. The work was brutal. In her old life, water came from a pump in the kitchen or a pitcher carried by a servant. Here, water was a heavy, precious burden that had to be hauled from a spring half a mile up a narrow, treacherous track. The clay jar weighed 30 pounds when full. The first time she tried to lift it to her shoulder, she dropped it. It shattered. The silence in the camp was absolute. Water was life. To waste it was a sin. Dasan walked over to where she stood trembling over the broken shards. He did not strike her, though she flinched, expecting the blow Edward would have given her for a lesser clumsiness. Instead, Dasan picked up a woven basket coated in pitch. He shoved it into her chest. "Again," he said, by the end of the week. Clara's shoulders ached with a constant, dull throb. Her hands, once soft and smelling of lavender soap, were calloused and stained with earth. But she did not drop the water again. Dasan taught her the language of survival, though he did so with the patience of a man training a stubborn mule. He showed her which dead wood would burn clean and which would smoke and sting the eyes. He taught her to shake out her blanket before lying down to dislodge scorpions. One afternoon, while gathering sagebrush near a pile of tumbled boulders, Clara reached for a thick branch. "Stop," Dasan said. His voice was not loud, but it had a whip-crack quality that froze her hand in mid-air. He moved toward her, silent as smoke, and used the barrel of his rifle to gently lift the branch she had been aiming for. Underneath, coiled in the shade, was a rattlesnake as thick as her arm. Its rattle buzzed, a dry, angry sound that made Clara's blood turn to ice. "Death sleeps there," Dasan said. "You look with your eyes, not just your hands." He lowered the branch. He did not kill the snake. He simply steered Clara around it, as if the viper were a neighbor they should not disturb. "Why didn't you kill it?" Clara asked, her voice shaking. "It was here first," he said. "Later that week, the lesson was harsher. They were on the rim of the mesa, looking for agave plants. The wind was gusting, throwing handfuls of grit into their faces." Clara stepped too close to the edge, mesmerized by the drop, a sheer plunge of 400 feet to the canyon floor. A sudden gust caught her skirts, acting like a sail. Her boots slipped on the slick rock. She felt gravity take hold, a sickening lurch in her stomach. She scrabbled at the air, finding nothing. A hand clamped around her wrist. It was a grip of steel. Dasan yanked her back from the precipice with such force that she slammed into his chest. For a moment, they were tangled together, her face pressed against the rough buckskin of his shirt, the smell of him filling her nose, sweat, wood smoke, and something muskier, like pine resin. She could feel his heart hammering against her ribs. Or perhaps it was her own. He did not let go immediately. He held her there, inches from safety, inches from death. She looked up into his face. The war paint was gone today. His eyes were dark, framed by thick lashes. And in them, she saw a flicker of something that terrified her more than the fall. It was not hatred. It was a stark, undeniable recognition. He was a man. She was a woman. And they were alive in a place that wanted them dead. "You look at the ground," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "Not the sky. The sky does not care if you fall." He released her abruptly and walked away, putting distance between them. Clara stood there, clutching her wrist where his fingers had left white marks that were slowly turning red. She felt a jolt run through her, a strange heat that had nothing to do with the sun. As the days turned into weeks, the camp began to change around her. Or perhaps she began to see it differently. At first, the Apache were a terrifying blur of noise and alien customs. But slowly, the blur sharpened into individuals. She saw the way the men played with their children, tossing them in the air and laughing with deep, belly-shaking sounds that contradicted everything she had heard about the stoic, heartless savage. She saw the women grooming each other's hair, whispering and giggling like girls in a parlor back east. She saw Nayland. The grieving mother still looked at Clara with eyes like flint. But one afternoon, Nayland was struggling to drag a heavy deer carcass toward the drying racks. Her bad leg, injured years ago, was buckling under the weight. Clara was scraping a hide nearby. She hesitated. To help was to invite scorn. To do nothing felt white. It felt like the woman she used to be. The woman who watched servants struggle with heavy trunks and never lifted a finger. Clara stood up. She walked over and grabbed the hind legs of the deer without a word. Nayland stiffened, her knife flashing in her hand. She looked at Clara, ready to spit a curse. Clara did not back down. She simply heaved, taking half the weight. Together, they dragged the carcass to the rack. When they were done, they stood panting, wiping sweat from their foreheads. Nayland looked at Clara's hands. Bloody, dirty, strong. She did not smile. She did not say thank you. But later that night, when the food was distributed, Nayland tossed an extra piece of roasted squash onto Clara's blanket. It was a truce. Clara became a fixture, an oddity. She was the stubborn guest who would not die and would not leave. The children, initially terrified of the ghost-faced woman, began to creep closer, touching the hem of her dress, fascinated by the blue fabric that was slowly fading to gray. But prejudice was a thick wall to break. One evening, a group of young warriors sat by the fire, gambling with bone dice. As Dasan walked past with Clara, one of them, a scarred man named Kalse, called out, "Does the white dog learn to bark yet?" "Dasan." Kalse laughed, looking at his friends. "Or does she only know how to whimper?" Dasan stopped. He turned slowly. He spoke in Apache, But the tone was clear enough. It was a warning. "She carries her own water?" Dasan said. "Can you say the same, Kalse? Or does your mother still chew your meat for you?" The other warriors laughed, and Kalse scowled, fingering his knife. But he said nothing more. Later, while Clara was grinding corn, an older woman leaned in close. Her face was a map of lines, her eyes milky with cataracts. "You watch him?" the woman whispered in broken English, gesturing toward Dasan. "He has a soft heart. It breaks easy. Your people, you break everything you touch. You are like the loco weed, pretty to look at, but poison to the horses." Clara wanted to argue. She wanted to say she was not her people. She was just Clara. But was she? She wore their clothes. She spoke their language. She carried their history of broken treaties in the color of her skin. She began to question the stories she had been fed since the cradle. The Apache were wolves. Her father had said, "They have no souls." But she watched Dasan sitting by the fire, repairing a toy bow for a crying child, his face softening into a gentle smile that transformed him. She saw the way the community moved as one organism, sharing the last scraps of meat during the lean days. No one eating until everyone had a portion. Where was the savagery? She found she could not locate it. One afternoon, the wind picked up, howling down from the north with a bite that promised winter was coming. Dasan found Clara near the horses and signaled for her to follow him. They walked out of the canyon, up a goat trail to a high, wind-swept ridge. The air here was thin and cold. Scraggy junipers clung to the rock, their roots exposed like old bones. Dasan stopped before a pile of stones. It was a grave. There were no crosses, no carved names, just a mound of earth and rock, protected from the coyotes. "My sister," Dasan said. He stood looking at the stones, his shoulders slumped. It was the first time Clara had seen him look defeated. "How?" she asked softly. Dasan crouched, picking up a small stone and placing it on the pile. "Winter camp. 3 years ago. We were hungry. The soldiers came. They had a white flag. You know this flag?" Clara nodded, a knot forming in her throat. "It means peace. It means we want to talk." "Yes," Dasan said bitterly. "Talk. My father went out to meet them. He walked tall. He believed the flag. They shot him first. Then they rode through the tents. My sister, she was running. She fell. He stopped. The wind howled through the canyon. A lonely, desolate sound. I found her after," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion, which made it all the worse. "She was broken, like a doll a child throws away." He looked up at Clara, his eyes wet but fierce. "I feel dead inside. Clara, most days. I look at the sun and I feel nothing. I look at the blood on my hands and I feel nothing. I am like this stone." Clara looked at him, and her heart broke, not for herself, but for him, for the boy he had been before the soldiers came. She sat down beside him on the cold earth. "I know about being broken," she said. Dasan looked at her, surprised. You? You are rich. You have soft hands." Clara laughed, a bitter, sharp sound. "Rich? Yes, my father has money. He has a big house, and he sold me to a man named Edward Mallory for a railroad contract." She picked up a handful of dirt, letting it sift through her fingers. "Edward, he liked to hurt things. He liked to see fear. 2 days before we left, I tried to tell him I didn't want to marry him. He took me into the library. He put his hands around my throat." She unconsciously raised a hand to her neck, remembering the pressure, the black spots dancing in her vision. "He squeezed until I couldn't breathe. He told me I was a pretty thing, a decoration, and if a decoration doesn't hang straight, you hammer a nail through it." She looked at Dasan. Tears were streaming down her face, but she didn't wipe them away. "My parents knew. I told my mother. She said to be quiet. She said, 'Don't make a scene. Clara, it is vulgar.'" She held out her hands. They were shaking violently, the tremors of a trauma she had buried under layers of etiquette and silence. "I was not a person to them. Dasan, I was a transaction." Dasan looked at her trembling hands, slowly, deliberately. He reached out, He took her hands in his. His palms were rough, calloused, warm. He did not squeeze. He just held them, steadying them, his thumbs brushing over her knuckles. He did not say, "I am sorry." He did not say, "That is sad." He offered no platitudes. He simply offered his strength. They sat there for a long time on the ridge, the white woman and the Apache warrior, holding hands over the grave of a murdered girl, while the wind tried to blow them off the edge of the world. The weather turned 2 nights later. It was not a gradual shift. It was a violent assault. A blue norther swept down from the peaks, bringing a wall of black clouds that bruised the sky purple. The temperature plummeted 30 degrees in an hour. Rain lashed the canyon, cold and stinging like sleet. It turned the dust to mud and soaked everything instantly. Clara was in her small shelter, huddled under her thin blanket. The wind tore at the brush walls, whistling through the gaps. She was shivering so hard her jaw ached. Her dress, still the damp calico, clung to her like a shroud. She curled into a ball, trying to preserve body heat, but the cold was inside her bones. A shadow fell across the entrance. Dasan stood there, water streaming from his hair, a buffalo robe thrown over his shoulders. He looked at her, seeing the blue tint of her lips. "Come," he said. "Where?" she chattered. "My fire. This—" He kicked the flimsy wall of her shelter. "This is no good. You freeze." Clara did not argue. She couldn't. She stumbled up, and he threw part of his robe over her, shielding her from the deluge as they ran to the larger wickiup where he slept. Inside, it was dry. A small fire burned in the center, the smoke venting through a hole in the roof. The air was thick and warm. Dasan pointed to a pile of furs near the fire. "Sit." Clara collapsed onto the furs. She was shaking uncontrollably now. Dasan added wood to the fire, then looked at her. "You are wet," he said. He turned his back. "Take off the dress. Wrap in the blanket." Clara hesitated only a second. Modesty was a luxury for the warm. She stripped off the sodden dress, her fingers fumbling with the buttons, and wrapped herself in a thick wool blanket he tossed her. When she sat back down, Dasan turned around. He sat close to her, closer than he ever had. The wickiup was small. There was nowhere else to go. He draped another fur over both of them. In the close dark, illuminated only by the dying embers, the world narrowed down to the two of them. Clara could hear his breathing, steady, slow. She could feel the heat radiating from his arm where it pressed against hers. Her rational mind screamed that this was wrong. He was a man, not her husband. He was a savage. She was a Christian woman, but her body did not care. Her body knew only that he was warm, and she was safe. For the first time in years, she felt safe. Not protected by walls or laws, but protected by him. Desire is a strange thing. It does not always arrive with fanfare. Sometimes it creeps in with the cold, born of necessity and proximity. Clara looked at his profile in the firelight. The sharp nose, the high cheekbones, the scar running down his neck. "What is freedom?" she whispered. The question just slipped out. Dasan turned his head. His eyes were very dark, very deep. "Freedom is the wind," he said. "You cannot hold it. You can only feel it when it moves." "I never felt it," Clara said. "Not until I came here. Is that madness, to feel free in a prison?" "No," Dasan said softly. "The canyon is not the prison. Your mind was the prison. The fear was the prison." He looked at her, a hint of a smile touching his lips. "And you ride like a sack of corn," he added. "That is also a prison." Clara blinked, then let out a startled laugh. "I do not," she protested. "You do," he said, the smile reaching his eyes. "You bounce. Thump, thump, thump. The horse is sad. I see it in his face." Clara laughed again, a genuine, bubbling sound that surprised them both. It was the first time she had laughed in months. "Well," she said, leaning slightly into his shoulder, emboldened by the warmth, "maybe if I had a proper saddle, and not just a slippery backbone, I would be more graceful." "We will see," Dasan said. "Tomorrow. I teach you. No saddle. You learn to ride with your legs. Or you walk to Mexico. I think I'll ride." she said. The silence that followed was not heavy. It was charged. The air between them hummed. Dasan did not move away. Clara did not pull back. They sat shoulder to shoulder, listening to the rain hammer against the earth, two castaways on a small, dry island. The next day, the sun returned, cold and bright. The riding lesson began. Dasan chose a mare, small but quick, with a coat like polished mahogany. He removed the saddle. He tossed Clara a rope hackamore. Up, he said. Clara looked at the horse. It looked very round and very slippery. She grabbed the mane and tried to haul herself up. She kicked, scrambled, and slid back down. Landing in the dust, Dasan did not help. He crossed his arms. The horse is laughing at you, he observed. Clara glared at him. She gritted her teeth. She grabbed the mane again, jumped, hooked her leg, and hauled herself onto the animal's back. She sat there, breathing hard, feeling precarious. The warmth of the horse seeped through her skirts. Dasan took the lead rope. He began to walk the horse. Knees. He instructed. Grip with knees, not hands. Hands are for guiding. Knees are for staying. They walked out of the canyon onto the flat scrubland. Dasan picked up the pace. The horse began to trot. The motion was jarring. Without stirrups. Clara felt like she was being shaken apart. She gripped the mane so tight her knuckles turned white. She clamped her legs, but her muscles were screaming. Relax, Dasan called out, jogging easily beside her. You fight the horse. Move with it, like water. I am not water, Clara shouted, bouncing painfully. I am bone and bruise. Dasan laughed. He slapped the horse's flank. The mare broke into a canter. Clara gasped. The world blurred. The wind rushed past her ears. For a second, she felt it, the rhythm, the power, the terrifying speed. But then she slipped. She slid sideways, losing her center of gravity. She hauled herself back up, panting, sweat stinging her eyes. Her thighs burned as if they were on fire. Her fingers were cramping from clenching the coarse hair of the mane. She pulled the horse to a halt. She slumped forward, resting her forehead against the animal's neck. I can't, she whispered. Dasan walked up to her side. He looked up at her, shielding his eyes from the sun. You can, he said. Clara shook her head, her chest heaving. She looked down at him, her face flushed, her hair coming loose from its braid. It's too hard, she murmured, her voice husky with exhaustion. It's too much for me. She was talking about the riding, about the pain in her legs, about the sheer, overwhelming difficulty of surviving in this land. Dasan looked at her. He stepped closer. He reached up. He did not pull her down. He placed his large, warm hands over hers, which were tangled in the mane. He covered her fingers with his own. Then use both hands, he said softly. The words hung in the air. He guided her grip, shifting her fingers so they locked deeper into the hair. He adjusted her posture, his hand brushing her waist, steadying her hips. The touch was electric. Clara stopped breathing. She looked down at his hands covering hers. They were strong, scarred, capable of killing, yet touching her with a reverence that made her knees weak. She looked into his eyes. He was looking up at her, and the playful teacher was gone. In his gaze was a hunger, raw and open. He was not looking at a student. He was looking at a woman he wanted to pull down into the sagebrush. Use both hands, he repeated, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through her. Hold on, Clara. Do not let go. I won't, she whispered. The double meaning passed between them like a spark jumping a gap. She wasn't just holding the horse. She was holding on to him, to this life. He held her gaze for a long moment, the tension stretching tight enough to snap. Then, he slowly withdrew his hands. He stepped back. Again, he said, his voice rough. They rode until sunset. That night, Clara lay on her blanket outside the wickiup. The air was crisp and cold. The storm had scrubbed the sky clean, and the Milky Way was a river of diamond dust spilled across the blackness. She traced the shape of Orion with her eyes. She thought about Edward and his cold, claiming grip. She thought about her mother's empty advice. Then she thought of Dasan's hands. She brought her own hands up to her face. She could still feel the phantom warmth of his palms covering hers. She could still feel the pressure of his hand on her waist. Her heart began to race, a slow, heavy thudding in her chest. She realized, with a mix of terrifying clarity and wondrous fear, that she was not planning her escape anymore. She was not looking at the North Star to find her way back to the settlements. She turned on her side, looking toward the wickiup where Dasan slept. She wanted him. She wanted the savage. She wanted the enemy. She wanted the man who had looked at her broken pieces and told her to use both hands to hold them together. It went against everything she had been taught. It was a sin. It was madness. But as the coyote cried out in the distance, Clara Hayes smiled into the darkness, and for the first time in her life, she did not feel alone. The wind changed in November. It stopped being a nuisance that merely kicked up dust and became a living thing with teeth, gnawing at the edges of the canyon until the stone itself seemed to shiver. The cottonwoods along the dry wash stripped down to gray skeletons, rattling their bones in the night. Hunger came with the cold. The deer had moved to lower ground, miles away where the grass was not yet frozen, and the jackrabbits were scarce and stringy. The tribe's cache of dried meat and mesquite beans was dwindling. In the evenings, the fires burned lower, fueled by precious wood gathered from the rim, and the conversations grew shorter, clipped by the tension of empty bellies. The debate began in whispers and grew into arguments that echoed off the canyon walls. The elders sat wrapped in buffalo robes, their faces like dried riverbeds, discussing the two paths that lay before them. To the north lay the high country, the White Mountains, where the snow would be deep but the soldiers rarely went. To the south lay the agency, the reservation where the White Eyes promised flour, beef, and blankets in exchange for their rifles and their freedom. Dasan sat on the periphery of these councils, his face a mask of brooding silence. He cleaned his Winchester until the metal gleamed, his eyes fixed on the fire. He knew what the reservation meant. It meant slow death. It meant men with spirits like eagles being turned into barnyard chickens, waiting for a farmer to toss them corn. Clara sat near him, mending a tear in his shirt with a bone needle. She wore a dress made of buckskin now, her blue calico finally having disintegrated under the strain of the desert. Her hair was braided in the Apache style, though strands of gold still escaped to frame a face that the sun had turned the color of apricots. She listened to the arguments she could barely understand, catching words like San Carlos, soldiers, and hunger. Then the trader came. He arrived on a mule, leading 2 pack horses, waving a dirty white handkerchief tied to a stick. He was a man named Silas Grimm, a creature of the borderlands who smelled of unwashed wool, rancid grease, and opportunism. He had been trading with the bands in this area for years, playing both sides against the middle, selling bad whiskey to the Apache and information to the army. The camp dogs snarled as he rode in, but the headman, a weary leader named Cochise, or perhaps a lesser chief, let's call him Taza, allowed him to dismount. Grimm brought flour, weevil-ridden and gray, and tins of tobacco, and kegs of rot-gut whiskey that burned the throat like lye. Clara kept her head down, busying herself with a hide near the back of the circle. She knew men like Grimm. She had seen them in the towns she passed through, men with eyes like coyotes who looked at women as if they were livestock to be priced. Grimm was haggling over the price of a stack of beaver pelts when his gaze drifted. It swept over the women, lingering, assessing. Then it stopped. He squinted, his tobacco-stained mouth falling open. "Well, I'll be damned," Grimm wheezed, wiping his nose with the back of a gloved hand. "That is a white woman." The chatter around the trade blankets stopped. Dasan, who had been standing near the horses, stepped forward. His movement was fluid, silent, and deadly. "She is not for trade," Dasan said, his English clear and cold. Grimm laughed, a wet, hacking sound. He took a step toward Clara, ignoring the tension that had suddenly coiled tight in every warrior present. "I know who you are," Grimm said, pointing a finger at her. "Saw the paper in Tucson. Saw it in Silver City, too. Big reward. $500. Gold. Man named Mallory. Says you were snatched. Says he will pay for your return. Alive. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. Edward. Even here. In the middle of the wasteland. His reach found her. He had put a price on her head like she was a runaway horse. She stood up, her chin trembling but held high. I was not snatched, Clara said, her voice shaking. I am not going back. Grim looked at her, then at Dasan, then back at the headman. A sly, calculating look entered his eyes. Taza, he said to the chief, this woman is trouble, big trouble. The army is coming. They are sweeping the Dragoon Mountains. They want the renegades. You keep her. They burn you out. You give her to me. I take her to the fort. You get the reward money, flour for the winter, blankets. No trouble. The headman looked at Clara. He looked at the hungry children watching the sacks of flour. It was a terrible arithmetic. Dasan moved. He placed himself between Grim and Clara. He did not draw his knife, but his hand rested on the hilt. She is under my protection, Dasan said. You touch her, Grim, and I will open your throat. The threat hung in the cold air, heavy and absolute. Grim's smile faltered. He looked at the other warriors. Some looked tempted by the offer of gold and flour. Others, the younger ones who hated the white men, looked ready to kill Grim just for suggesting it. Taza stood up. He was old, and he was tired of burying his people. No blood here, Taza said. The traitor leaves. Now. Grim spat on the ground. He glared at Dasan. You are a fool. Apache. The cavalry is a day's ride east. They are looking for you. You think you can fight the whole world for one girl? I will fight, Dasan said. Grim mounted his mule, his eyes cold. He looked at Clara one last time. $500, he muttered. That is a lot of money for used goods. Dasan surged forward, a snarl ripping from his throat. But two other warriors held him back. Grim kicked his mule and rode out of the canyon, leaving a trail of dust and poison behind him. That night, the camp was thick with tension. The whiskey Grim had left was gone, drank quickly by men who wanted to forget the hunger, and the arguments had turned bitter. Clara sat by the small fire outside Dasan's wickiup. She was shivering, but not from the cold. You should have let him take me, she said into the darkness. Dasan was sharpening his knife. The rhythmic shh sound the only noise in the silence. He stopped and looked at her. Is that what you want? To go back to the man who buys you? No, Clara snapped, turning to face him. The sudden anger surprised her. No, but I am killing you. Grim is right. The army will come because of me. Your people, they are hungry. They look at me and see $500. They see flour for their children. Who am I to deny them that? She stood up, pacing the small space of hard-packed earth. I am a curse. Dasan, I was a curse to my parents, a curse to Edward, and now a curse to you. You should trade me. You could buy rifles. You could go north. Dasan stood up. He crossed the distance between them in 2 strides. He grabbed her shoulders. His grip was hard, shaking her slightly. Stop, he commanded. He looked down into her face, his eyes searching hers. The army comes anyway. Clara, if you are here, they come. If you are gone, they come. They do not need a reason. They want the land. They want the water. You are just the excuse. Clara looked at him, tears welling in her eyes. The firelight cast shadows across his face, making the scar on his cheek look deeper. I am afraid, she whispered. Not for me, for you. Why? Because... She choked on the words, then let them spill out, raw and honest. Because they call you savages. They say you are monsters. But Edward, he wore fine silk suits and drank French brandy, and he hurt me more than anyone here ever has. She reached up, her hand hovering near his chest. I have been colder here than I ever was in the East. I have been hungrier. My hands are ruined, but... She took a ragged breath. But I have never felt more human than I do when I am with you. Dasan went very still. The wind howled through the canyon, rattling the dry brush. But in the circle of the firelight, the world stopped. He looked at the white woman who had ridden his horse with bleeding legs, who had carried water until her back broke, who stood now in buckskins and defended his people against her own. He reached up and cupped her face. His hand was rough, calloused from war and work, but his touch was feather-light. His thumb brushed away a tear that was tracking through the dust on her cheek. "You are not a curse," he said, his voice low and vibrating in his chest. "You are the only warm thing left in this world." He lowered his head. It was not a claiming kiss. It was not like the rough, demanding kisses Edward had forced on her hand. It was a question, a hesitation. Clara closed the gap. She rose on her tiptoes and pressed her lips to his. For a moment, he froze, as if he expected the earth to split open. Then, with a low sound in his throat, he kissed her back. His hands trembled against her face. It was the trembling of a man who could stop a charging horse but was terrified of crushing a butterfly. The kiss tasted of wood smoke and sorrow and a desperate, starving need. It was a seal on a promise neither of them had spoken aloud. When they broke apart, breathless, Dasan rested his forehead against hers. "They will not take you," he whispered fiercely. "I will burn the world before I let them take you." The next morning, the camp knew. There were no secrets in a canyon where families slept 10 feet apart. The way Dasan looked at her, the way Clara sat closer to him at the fire, it was enough. Nalin watched them with eyes that were black pits of judgment. She spat into the fire whenever Clara walked by. "He mates with the Deathbringer." Nalin muttered to the other women. "She will lead the blue coats to our beds. She will be the end of us." But not everyone agreed. An old warrior named Chi, who had lost his wife to smallpox years ago, watched them with a sad smile. "Let them have it," Chi said. "The winter is long. Let them have a little fire." 3 days later, the reality of their life returned with bloody teeth. Dasan went out with a hunting party to track a mountain lion that had been stalking the horses. They were gone for 2 days. Clara waited, her stomach churning with a nausea that had nothing to do with hunger. When they returned, Dasan was slumped over his horse. Clara ran to him before the horse had even stopped. He slid from the animal's back, landing heavily in her arms. His shirt was soaked with blood. He slipped. One of the men said, "The cat." It was fast. The rocks were ice. They carried him to his wickiup. Clara drove everyone else out. She boiled water. She tore strips from her remaining petticoat. The wound was ugly, a deep gash running from his shoulder down his bicep, jagged and weeping. He had lost a lot of blood. His skin was gray, clammy to the touch. Clara worked with a focus she didn't know she possessed. She cleaned the wound, ignoring his sharp intake of breath. She stitched the skin with a bone needle and sinew, her hands steady even though her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "I am sorry," Dasan rasped, his eyes fluttering open. "I brought no meat." Clara tied the final knot and cut the thread. She looked at him, incredulous. "You are bleeding to death, and you apologize for the meat?" She wiped his forehead with a damp cloth. "Be quiet," she said softly. "Rest." He watched her as she worked. The pain was a dull roar in his shoulder, but the sensation of her hands on his skin was sharper. She touched him not as a servant, not as a captive, but as a woman claiming what was hers. When she was finished, she sat back, exhausted. The wickiup was cold. The fire had burned down to embers. "Come," Dasan whispered. He lifted his good arm, lifting the buffalo robe that covered him. Clara hesitated. He was wounded. "You are cold," he said. "Come." She crawled under the heavy fur. She lay beside him, careful not to jostle his injured shoulder. The heat of his body was immense, a furnace against the chill of the night. He turned his head to look at her. They were inches apart, the fear of the future, the shame of her past, the hunger in her belly. It all faded. There was only the beat of his heart and the dark depth of his eyes. "Clara." He said her name like a prayer. She reached out and touched his chest, feeling the steady thump of life beneath the bronze skin. "I am here," she said. The transition was as natural as breathing. There was no fumbling, no awkwardness, only a slow, deliberate coming together. He touched her with a reverence that made her want to weep. He traced the line of her jaw, the curve of her hip, as if he were memorizing her. Clara had been raised to believe that the act of love was a duty, a submission to a husband's needs. With Edward, the prospect had been a nightmare of violation. With Dasan, it was a conversation. It was a language spoken without words. It was her skin saying, "I trust you," and his hands saying, "I honor you." When they finally joined, it was not a conquest. It was a desperate clinging. Two people drowning in a vast ocean, finding the only solid timber in the waves. It was intense, shadowed by the knowledge that death walked just outside the thin walls of the shelter. They loved each other with the ferocity of people who know they might not see the sunrise. Afterward, they lay tangled together, the sweat cooling on their skin. The wind howled outside, a lonely, mournful sound. Dasan ran his hand down her hair. "Do you regret?" he asked quietly. "Choosing this? Choosing me?" Clara rested her head on his good shoulder. She looked at the smoke hole where a single star was visible. "I regret that I did not find you sooner," she said. "I regret that the world is blind, but I do not regret this." She tightened her arm across his chest. "I only fear that they will not let us keep it." Dasan kissed the top of her head. "Then we make them fight for it." The days that followed were a strange, suspended dream. The tribe knew. Taza, the headman, called them to his fire. He did not scold. He performed the simple rite of their people. He tied the edges of their blankets together, spoke words to the four directions, and blessed them with corn pollen. It was not a church wedding. There was no organ, no white dress, just the smell of wood smoke, the cold wind, and an old man's blessing. But to Clara, it was more holy than any cathedral. For a week, they were happy. They shared chores. They had private jokes. Clara would mock his serious expression, calling him Old Stone Face, and he would tease her about her bird feet that stumbled over pebbles. They learned the map of each other's bodies and the cadence of each other's laughter. But happiness in the borderlands is a fragile thing. It shattered on a Tuesday morning. A scout came running down from the rim, his chest heaving, his face gray with fear. He shouted to Taza, pointing toward the east. "Dust! A column of dust!" Dasan grabbed his rifle and ran to the lookout point. Clara followed, her heart in her throat. Miles away, across the shimmering basin, a long line of blue was moving toward the canyon mouth. The sun glinted off metal, carbines, sabers, and riding at the front, guiding them, was a man on a mule. Even at this distance, the slouch was unmistakable. Silas Grimm. He had sold them. He had gone straight to the fort and sold the location of the camp for the reward money on Clara's head and the bounty on Apache scalps. The camp erupted into chaos. Mothers grabbed children, men grabbed weapons, dogs barked. Taza called a council in the center of the camp. The wind whipped his gray hair around his face. "There are too many," Taza said, his voice heavy with defeat. 200 soldiers, maybe more. We have 20 rifles. "We cannot fight. We cannot surrender," Dasan shouted, stepping into the circle. His shoulder was stiff, but his voice was strong. "If we go to San Carlos, we die slowly. We die of fever and sadness. If we fight, we die today." Taza countered. "Look at the children. Dasan, look at the women. Would you have them slaughtered?" Dasan looked at Clara. He saw the terror in her eyes. He knew what would happen if the soldiers took her. They would return her to Mallory. They would hang Dasan. "I will not go," Dasan said. Taza looked at him with great sadness. "Then you go alone. I will take the people out under the white flag. We will go to the agency. We will live." The tribe began to split. It was a tearing of the soul. Most of the families, beaten down by hunger and fear, began to pack for surrender. They would walk out to meet the soldiers. But a few, the hard ones, the ones who had lost too much to ever trust a white flag again, moved to stand by Dasan. Nalin was there, her face set like granite. 3 other young warriors and their wives. Dasan turned to Clara. "Go with Taza," he said quickly, his voice tight. "They will take you back to your people. You will be safe. You will have food." Clara looked at the column of dust on the horizon. She thought of Edward. She thought of the parlor walls that felt like a coffin. Then she looked at Dasan. She looked at the man who had taught her to use both hands. "No," she said. "Clara, I am your wife," she said, using the Apache word he had taught her. "Where you go, I go." Dasan stared at her. He saw the steel in her spine. He nodded once, then run. He said. They moved under the cover of the confusion, while Taza prepared the white flag. Dasan's small group slipped away toward the back of the canyon, toward a steep, treacherous goat trail that led up into the high rocks. They took what they could carry: rifles, a little dried meat, blankets. They left everything else. The climb was brutal. The trail was a slash of loose shale against a vertical cliff. Clara's lungs burned. Her legs shook. Every step sent stones clattering down into the void. Below them, they heard the bugle call of the approaching cavalry. They heard the shouts of the soldiers. "Don't look down," Dasan hissed, gripping her arm as she stumbled. They crested the rim just as the sun began to fail. The wind up here was a physical blow. Screaming across the flat mesas, they did not stop. They ran. They moved into the jagged, broken country of the Mongolian Rim, a place of deep ravines and towering pines. As night fell, the temperature plummeted, and then the first flake of snow drifted down, then another. The desert was gone. They were in the high country now. Clara pulled her blanket tighter, her teeth chattering. She looked back one last time toward the lowlands, toward the world she was leaving forever. There was nothing there but dust and betrayal. She turned forward, toward the dark mountains and the snow. Dasan was there, waiting for her, his hand outstretched. She took it. She used both hands, and together, they walked into the freezing dark. The mountains were not a refuge. They were a gauntlet of gray stone and ice that tried to strip the flesh from their bones with every mile they climbed. The party moved like ghosts through a landscape that had forgotten the meaning of warmth. The red dust of the lowlands was gone, replaced by sharp granite that sliced through moccasins and the makeshift hide wrappings Clara had tied around her ruined shoes. The air here was thin, a meager substance that burned going down and tasted of iron when it came back up. Clara felt as if a heavy stone had been placed on her chest. Every breath was a negotiation with her own lungs. She did not complain. She bit the inside of her cheek until she tasted blood, using the pain to anchor herself when the dizziness threatened to send her toppling over the edge of the trail. She watched the Apache women ahead of her, women carrying infants on their backs and bundles of food in their arms, moving with a grim, silent determination. If they could do it, she would do it. She would not be the weak link that snapped the chain. Dasan walked behind her, his presence a constant pressure against her back. He did not offer to carry her, for he carried the heaviest pack in his rifle, but she felt his eyes on her. When she stumbled, his hand would be there instantly, gripping her elbow, steadying her, and then vanishing as soon as she found her footing. They made camp on the third night in a narrow slot canyon carved by ancient waters. The walls rose 300 feet on either side, blocking out the wind but funneling the cold into a deep, stagnant pool at the bottom. They huddled together without a fire. Fire meant smoke, and smoke meant death. They ate dried venison that was as hard as wood, softening it with saliva before risking a swallow. The sound came first as a vibration in the ground, a low thrumming that Clara felt in her teeth before she heard it with her ears. Dasan's head snapped up. He looked at the sky, which was clear and star-filled above the canyon rim. "Up!" he hissed, the word cutting through the exhausted silence of the camp. "Move! Now!" The others did not question him. They scrambled, grabbing children and weapons. Then Clara heard it, a roar, like a freight train made of gravel and thunder, echoing off the stone walls. It was a flash flood, born from a storm miles away in the higher peaks, a wall of water rushing through the dry veins of the mountain. Clara scrambled up the sloping talus pile at the base of the cliff. Her boots slipped on the loose shale. Behind her, the roar grew deafening. Dasan shoved her upward. "Climb!" he shouted. She grabbed a root of scrub oak and hauled herself up just as the water hit. It was not clean water. It was a slurry of mud. boulders, and uprooted trees, churning with a violence that shook the canyon floor. It smashed into the campsite they had just vacated, swallowing the flat ground in seconds. The noise was apocalyptic. Clara clung to the rock face, staring down into the churning blackness. The spray hit her face, freezing cold and smelling of churned earth. Above the roar of the water, a scream tore through the air. It was a high, thin sound. Clara looked to her left. A young woman was reaching out, screaming a name. Cale. Clara saw him, a boy of 7 or 8, caught on a lower ledge as the water rose. He was clinging to a boulder, his eyes wide white circles in the darkness. The water was already lapping at his waist, pulling at him with greedy fingers. Dasan was too far away. He was higher up, helping an elder. Clara did not think. She slid down the slope, skidding on her stomach, shredding the buckskin dress. She reached out, her hand straining toward the boy. "Take my hand," she screamed. The boy looked at her. He reached out. Their fingers brushed. Wet, cold skin against wet. Cold skin. Then a tree trunk, carried by the flood like a battering ram, slammed into the boulder. The impact was thunderous. The boulder shifted. The boy lost his grip. Clara lunged, her fingers clawing at the air, but he was gone, swallowed instantly by the black, churning muscle of the flood. "No!" Clara screamed. The sound ripped from her throat. Dasan was there a second later, grabbing Clara by the back of her dress and hauling her up the slope before the water could take her too. He dragged her to a high shelf of rock where the others were huddled. The flood raged for an hour, then began to recede as quickly as it had come, leaving behind a canyon scoured clean of life. The silence that followed was worse than the roar. Nylon sat on a stone, rocking back and forth. The boy was her nephew, the son of her dead sister. She looked at the dark mud below. Then she turned her head slowly to look at Clara, in the moonlight. Naylin's face was a mask of ancient tragedy. Her eyes were dry, but they burned with a cold, terrifying light. "You," Nalin whispered. The word carried across the small space like a curse. Dasan stepped between them. "Nalin," he said, his voice a warning. "The water takes who it takes. It was the storm." Nalin stood up. She pointed a trembling finger at Clara. "The storm follows her." Nalin hissed. "The soldiers follow her. Death follows her." She touched the boy. "I saw it. She reached for him, and the water took him. Her touch is poison. I tried to save him." Clara choked out, shivering violently. "I tried. You failed," Nalin said. "You always fail, because you do not belong here. You are a ghost that walks among the living, and you drag us down to the underworld with you." "Enough," Dasan said. He did not shout, but his voice had the finality of a slamming door. He put his arm around Clara, but she felt rigid, brittle as dried twigs. She pulled away from him, retreating to the far edge of the rock shelf. She curled into a ball, burying her face in her knees. Naylan was right. The thought took root in her mind, a poisonous seed finding fertile soil in her guilt. She was the anomaly. She was the foreign object in the body of the tribe, and the land was trying to expel her, taking innocent pieces of them in the process. Dasan came to her later, offering her a piece of dry blanket. "It was not your fault," he said quietly. Clara did not look up. "Wasn't it?" she whispered. "If I wasn't here, maybe you would have camped higher. Maybe you would have moved faster. Maybe the universe wouldn't be punishing you for harboring me. The universe does not care about us." "Clara," Dasan said, sitting beside her. "The rain falls on the lizard and the hawk alike. Cale is gone. That is a hard stone to swallow, but do not make it harder by carrying it alone." Clara looked at her hands. They were scraped raw, the fingernails broken. They looked like the hands of a stranger. "I feel heavy." "Dasan," she said, "I feel like I'm dragging you all into the grave." He took her hand, unfolding her clenched fingers. "Then I will carry the weight," he said, "until you are strong enough to carry it yourself." They moved on at first light. The grief in the group was a palpable thing. a silence that sat on their shoulders, heavier than the pack's. 2 days later, they faced the wall. It was a sheer face of granite, rising 500 feet to a high basin that Dasan promised would offer shelter. There was a fissure running up the side, a chimney of rock that offered a precarious route. They climbed in single file. It was grueling work. The wind whipped around the face of the cliff, trying to peel them off. Clara was near the top. Her muscles were trembling with a fatigue so deep it felt like her blood had turned to lead. Her fingers were numb from the cold, hooked into a narrow crack in the stone. She looked up. 10 feet of smooth rock separated her from the ledge. She looked down, a drop of 1,000 feet, ending in jagged talus. Her foot slipped. She gasped, clinging by her fingertips, her cheek pressed against the icy stone. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in her chest. "I can't," she whispered. Her arms were shaking. Her grip was failing. Dasan was below her, braced on a narrow shelf. He saw the tremble in her legs. He saw the way her head dropped against the rock. "Clara," he said, "it's too hard." She sobbed, the words torn from her by the wind. "It is too much for me. I cannot do it." She wasn't just talking about the climb. She was talking about Cale. She was talking about the hatred in Nalen's eyes. She was talking about the impossible, crushing weight of loving a man the world wanted to kill. Dasan climbed up until he was just below her. He could not lift her. The angle was too awkward. He could only steady her. He placed his hand over her boot, pressing it firmly onto the small nub of rock she was standing on. "Look at me," he commanded. Clara turned her head. His face was inches from hers. His eyes were not hard. They were warm, filled with a fierce, terrifying belief in her. "You are not done," he said. "I am," she whispered. "I am empty." "No," he said. "You are full of fear. Use the fear." He reached up with his free hand and took her left hand, which was scrabbling uselessly at the smooth stone. He guided it upward, jamming her fingers into a deep, hidden crack she hadn't seen. "Then use both hands," he said softly. The memory of the horse, of the desert, of the first time he had touched her with intent, flooded back. It was a call to arms. It was a reminder that she was not alone. "Use both hands." "Clara," he said, his voice a low rumble against the wind. "Hold on to the rock. Hold on to me. We do not fall today." Clara closed her eyes. She inhaled the thin, freezing air. She felt the warmth of his hand on her foot, the solid anchor of his presence. She opened her eyes. She tightened her grip. She pulled. She dragged herself up the last 10 feet, gasping, crying, scraping her knees raw, until she rolled over the lip of the basin and collapsed onto a bed of pine needles. Dasan pulled himself up after her. He lay beside her, breathing hard. He reached out and took her hand, squeezing it hard. "See," he said, "you are still here." The high valley was a secret place, hidden from the world by a ring of saw-toothed peaks. There was a stream that ran clear and cold, unfrozen in the center, and a stand of ancient ponderosa pines that offered shelter from the wind. They built a camp. It was temporary. They all knew it was temporary, but for a few weeks, it felt like a kingdom. They built a wickiup from pine boughs and elk hides. It was small, low to the ground to keep the heat in. Inside that small shelter, the nights belonged to them. The cold outside was a living thing, prowling the perimeter, snapping the branches of the pines, but under the pile of buffalo robes and deer skins, it was warm. Clara and Dasan turned to each other with a desperation that had sharpened into something sacred. The frantic energy of the flight faded, replaced by a slow, deep exploration. They lay face to face in the dark, their legs tangled together. "You have a scar here," Clara whispered, tracing a white line on his hip. "A lance," Dasan murmured, his hand moving lazily through her hair, unbraiding it until it spread like a golden fan across the furs. "Comanche, long ago, and here?" She touched a burn mark on his forearm. "Blacksmith," he said, "in Tucson. Before I knew better than to walk into town." He took her hand and kissed the palm, then the wrist, then the soft skin of her inner arm. "You are all scars," he said softly, "but you wear them on the inside." Clara shivered. "Not from cold. I used to think my scars made me ugly." She confessed, "Edward, He wanted a doll. Dolls don't have scars. They don't bleed. Dasan moved over her, his weight pressing her down into the furs, grounding her. "You are not a doll," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You are the rock. You are the flood. You are beautiful because you bleed and you heal." Their lovemaking was not a distraction from the danger. It was an act of defiance against it. Every touch was a statement. "We are still alive. You have not killed us yet." They moved together slowly, savoring the friction of skin against skin, the sound of breath catching in throats, the heat that built between them until it seemed bright enough to light the dark shelter. Clara clung to his shoulders, her nails digging in, whispering his name into the hollow of his neck. Dasan held her as if she were the only solid thing in a dissolving world, burying his face in her hair, breathing her in the afterglow. As the sweat cooled and they pulled the robes tight around their chins, they whispered promises they knew were lies, but loved anyway. "We will go to Mexico," Dasan said. "Deep into the Sierra Madre. The blue coats do not go there. We will build a cabin," Clara added, closing her eyes. "With a window facing the sunrise and a garden, I will grow squash. And horses," Dasan said. "Many horses. Fat ones. It was a beautiful story. It was the only thing that let them sleep. But the daylight brought reality back. The tension in the camp was a tightly stretched wire. Food was critically low. They were eating pine nuts and the bark of aspen trees. The elders were growing weak. Nalin called a council while Dasan was checking the snares. She pointed to the valley entrance. "We cannot stay," she said. "The winter will kill us if the soldiers don't. We must move west, toward the Verde." "And the white woman?" an elder asked. "She goes south," Nalin said, her voice hard. "She goes to the settlements. She draws the soldiers like a carcass draws vultures. If she leaves, they might follow her. They might leave us be." Clara stood at the edge of the circle, listening. She felt the eyes of the tribe on her. Some were sympathetic, but most were just tired. Tired of running. Tired of starving. Dasan returned and heard the end of the argument. He dropped a brace of scrawny rabbits on the snow and stepped into the circle. "She stays," he said. "She kills us," Nalin shouted, her composure cracking. "She is a weight around our necks." "Dasan, look at your people. Look at Taza's widow. She is eating boiled leather. Do you sacrifice us all for one white girl? I sacrifice no one," Dasan snarled. "But I do not throw my wife to the wolves to save my own skin. That is the way of cowards. That is the way of the White Eyes." "We are not White Eyes," Nalin retorted. "But we are dying." The argument ended without resolution, but the fracture was there. Clara saw it in the way the others looked away when she passed. She was not one of them. She never would be. She was the anchor dragging them down. 3 days later, the scouts returned. They did not run. They walked, their heads low. That was how Clara knew it was bad. "Dust," the lead scout said. 2 columns, coming from the east and the south. They have trackers. How far?" Dasan asked. "Half a day, maybe less." The silence that fell over the camp was absolute. There was no way out. The pass to the north was blocked by deep snow. To the west lay sheer cliffs. They were boxed in. "They have us." A woman wept, clutching her baby. Clara looked around the circle. She saw the fear in the children's eyes. She saw the resignation in the elders. She looked at Dasan. He was checking his rifle, his face set in a grim, stony expression. He was preparing to die. He would stand in front of this ragtag group of starving families and fight 2 columns of cavalry until he was cut down. He would die for her. The thought was a physical pain, sharp and agonizing. Clara walked away from the fire. She went to the stream and broke the thin layer of ice. She splashed the freezing water on her face. She looked at her reflection. She looked different. Her face was thin, her eyes huge and shadowed. But she looked strong. Grim had said it. $500. A reward. Edward wanted his property back. The army wanted the captive rescued. As long as she was here, the army had a moral crusade. They were rescuing a white woman from savages. They would burn the valley to get to her. But if she wasn't here, if she was down there, on the plain, walking toward them? Then the narrative changed. They would have the prize. They would have the victory. They might, just might, decide that chasing a few starving Apache into the snow wasn't worth the effort if they already had the girl. The idea terrified her. It made her knees shake. To go back to Edward. To go back to the cage. But then she looked back at the camp. She saw Dasan showing a young boy how to load a pistol. "I love you," she whispered to the cold air. And because she loved him, she had to leave him. She waited until the darkest hour, just before the dawn grayed the eastern peaks. The camp was asleep, exhausted by fear. Dasan was sleeping deeply, his arm thrown over his eyes. Clara knelt beside him. She memorized his face, the curve of his lip, the pulse in his neck. She did not kiss him. If she touched him, she would not be able to leave. She placed her small amulet, a stone with a hole in it that she had found in the river, on his chest. "Goodbye, my heart," she whispered. She stood up. She took only her blanket and a strip of dried meat. She stepped out into the snow. The cold bit through her moccasins immediately. She did not stop. She walked past the sentry who had dozed off against a tree. She found the game trail that led down out of the basin. She walked for an hour, the sky slowly turning the color of a bruise. She was halfway down the slope when she heard the shout behind her. "Clara!" It was a roar of pure agony. She froze. She closed her eyes. "Run!" she told herself. "Run!" But she couldn't. She turned. Dasan was sprinting down the slope, sliding on the scree, reckless and fast. He reached her in seconds. He grabbed her arms, spinning her around. His chest was heaving, his eyes wild. "Where are you going?" he demanded. "I'm going back," she said, keeping her voice steady, though her heart was breaking. "No," he shook her. "No, you are confused. The fear. It is not fear. Dasan!" She pulled away from him. "It is logic. Look!" She pointed down the mountain. In the growing light, the columns of dust were visible. They were closer now. "They are coming for me," she said. "If I am with you, they will kill everyone. If I go to them, they stop." "You do not know that," Dasan shouted. "I know Edward," Clara shouted back. "He wants his possession. He wants to win. If I give him the win, he will lose interest in you. I do not care." Dasan grabbed her face, his fingers digging into her cheeks. "I do not care about the soldiers. I do not care about Edward. I care about you. You are my wife. You do not leave. I have to," she sobbed, the tears finally spilling over. "I cannot watch you die. Dasan, I cannot watch them kill you. And you think I can watch you go back to him?" Dasan asked, his voice cracking. "You think that is mercy? That is death. Clara, that is a slower death. It is a life," she insisted. "You will live. Nalin will live. The children will live. I do not want a life without you." The confession hung between them, raw and bleeding. Clara stepped in close. She kissed him, hard and desperate, tasting the salt of their tears. "Then live for me," she whispered against his lips. "Use both hands. Dasan, hold on." She shoved him back. "Hard. Go!" she screamed. She turned and ran. "Clara!" he screamed after her. She didn't look back. She scrambled down the last of the slope, tearing her hands on the brush, falling, getting up, running toward the open ground. She saw the riders emerging from the tree line below. Blue coats, the glint of brass, and in the lead, a man in a thick woolen coat with a fur collar. Edward. She slowed to a walk. She raised her hands in the air. Dasan, watching from the cover of the pines, raised his rifle. He leveled the sights on Edward's chest. His finger tightened on the trigger. One shot, he could end it. But then he saw the soldiers raise their carbines, aiming at Clara. If he shot, the chaos would start. Clara would be caught in the crossfire. He lowered the rifle. A sound ripped from his throat, a sob that sounded like an animal dying. Clara walked toward the soldiers. "Don't shoot!" she screamed, her voice shrill. "I am here. I am Clara Hayes." Edward spurred his horse forward. He rode up to her, looking down with a mixture of relief and disgust. He saw the buckskins, the braided hair, the dirt. "My God!" "Clara," Edward said, wrinkling his nose. "You look like a savage." Clara looked up at him. She felt cold, dead cold. "They took me." She lied, her voice loud enough for the soldiers to hear. "They dragged me from the wagon. I escaped last night. They are gone. They went north, into the high snows. They are days ahead." She pointed away from the hidden basin, away from Dasan. Edward signaled the soldiers. "You heard her. Sergeant, get her a horse. We have the prize. No sense chasing ghosts in a blizzard." A soldier brought a horse. Edward reached down and hauled Clara up behind him. She did not hold his waist. She gripped the saddle cantle, her knuckles white. She looked back at the tree line. She saw nothing but shadows and pines, but she felt him. She felt his eyes on her. "I love you," she mouthed. Dasan watched as the column turned around. He watched as the woman who was his heart, his breath, and his blood rode away into the world that hated him. 2 other Apache warriors, who had followed him down, grabbed his arms as he made a move to run after them. "No, Dasan," one whispered. "It is done. She bought us life. Do not throw it away." Dasan fell to his knees in the snow. He watched until the dust swallowed her. Then he bowed his head and let the cold take him. Silver City was not silver. It was brown. It was a scar of unpainted lumber and trampled mud gouged into the side of a scrubby hill, smelling of horse manure, raw sewage, and the metallic tang of crushed ore. To Clara, who had spent months breathing the thin, holy air of the high peaks, the town smelled like sickness. She rode down the main street on an army mare, surrounded by a detail of 6 troopers. Her hands were folded on the pommel of the saddle. She wore a borrowed dress of gray wool that was 2 sizes too big, and a bonnet that blocked her peripheral vision like the blinders on a mule. But the blinders could not block the sound. The street was lined with people, men in bowler hats and canvas coats, women clutching shawls, miners with faces black from the drifts. They did not cheer, they stared. The silence was thick, broken only by the sucking sound of hooves in the mud and the whisper of gossip that ran ahead of her like a grass fire. "That is her," a woman whispered loud enough for Clara to hear. "The Mallory girl." "Look at her hands," a man muttered. "Look at the skin. She has been out there too long. She is ruined," another voice hissed. "They say she lived as a squaw. They say she chose it." Clara kept her chin level. She fixed her eyes on the back of the sergeant's jacket. She would not cry. She had survived flood and famine and the terror of the spear. She would not be broken by the whispers of shopkeepers. Edward Mallory rode at the head of the column. He sat his horse with the pompous rigidity of a general, doffing his hat occasionally to men he recognized. He was playing a role. Clara realized with a sick lurch of her stomach. He was the hero. He was the grieving, steadfast fiancé who had ridden into the jaws of hell to retrieve his stolen property. They pulled up in front of the largest building in town, a 2-story hotel with a false front. Edward dismounted and came to her side. He reached up to help her down. His hands were soft. They smelled of lavender water and expensive soap. When he gripped her waist, his fingers dug in, just a fraction too hard. A warning. "Smile." "My dear," he murmured, his voice low and devoid of warmth. "You are safe now. Try to look grateful." Clara slid from the saddle. Her legs, accustomed to gripping a horse bareback, felt heavy and clumsy in the layers of petticoats. She looked at him. "I am tired, Edward," she said. He squeezed her arm, steering her toward the boardwalk. "We have a lot to fix. Clara, a lot of damage control. You will stay with the Reverend Gable and his wife until the hearing. It would be improper for you to stay at the hotel. People are already talking." "Talking about what?" she asked, though she knew. "About your condition," he said, his lip curling slightly. "About what those animals did to you, and what you might have done to survive." He leaned close, his breath hot on her ear. "We will tell them you were a prisoner, Clara, that you fought every day, that you hate them. Do you understand? If you say anything else, if you shame me, I will leave you to the wolves." Clara looked at the crowd. She saw judgment in every pair of eyes. She realized then that the Apache camp, with its open fires and honest hunger, had been a paradise compared to this. The Gable house was a small, stifling box on the edge of town, filled with the smell of beeswax and self-righteousness. Reverend Gable was a tall, skeletal man with eyes that seemed to be constantly counting sins, and his wife, Martha, was a round, nervous woman who treated Clara like a bomb that might explode at any moment. For 3 days, Clara was a prisoner again. The windows were nailed shut. The lace curtains were drawn to keep out the sun and the prying eyes. Martha Gable scrubbed Clara's skin with lye soap until it was raw, as if she could scour the brown tint of the desert from her flesh. "We must pray." "Clara," the Reverend said every evening before a dinner of boiled potatoes and dry roast, "we must pray for the cleansing of your soul. You have walked in the valley of shadow. You have lain with beasts." Clara sat at the table, her hands folded until her knuckles were white. "They were not beasts," she said quietly on the second night. "They were people. They saved my life." The Reverend slammed his hand on the table. The silverware rattled. "Do not speak blasphemy in this house," he thundered. "They are heathens, murderers. They have no souls. Girl, whatever they did to you, whatever twisted Stockholm affection you feel, it is the devil's work. You must confess it. You must repent of it." "I have nothing to repent," Clara said, meeting his gaze. Martha Gable let out a small squeak of horror. The Reverend's face turned purple. "You are soiled," he hissed. "You are damaged goods. Miss Hayes. Mr. Mallory is a saint to even consider taking you back. You should be on your knees thanking God for his charity." Clara stood up. She walked to the window and peered through a crack in the lace. She could see the dusty street. She could see the mountains in the distance, blue and cool. "Charity?" she whispered. "Yes, that is what you call it." On the 4th day, the questioning began. She was taken to the sheriff's office, a cramped room that smelled of stale tobacco and gun oil. A territorial judge named Holloway sat behind a desk, looking bored. An army captain, a man named Sterling with a scar across his nose, stood by the window. Edward sat in the corner, watching. "Tell us about the leader," Sterling said, leaning forward. "The one they called Hassan." Clara sat on a wooden stool. She kept her hands clasped in her lap to hide the shaking. "He is a warrior," she said. "He is a killer," Sterling corrected. "He led the raid on the Miller Ranch last spring, burned a family alive." Did he boast of this? He never spoke of burning families. Clara said he spoke of his sister. He spoke of how soldiers shot her under a flag of truce. Sterling's face hardened. "That is a lie. Apache propaganda. Now, tell us where they were heading." "The basin." "Where is it?" "I told you." Clara lied, her voice steady. "They went north, to the high snows. They said the soldiers could not follow there." Edward shifted in his chair. "She is confused." "Captain," Edward said smoothly, "the trauma, her mind is fragile." "I am not fragile," Clara snapped, turning to him. "And I am not confused." The door to the office opened. A young corporal stepped in, looking breathless. He held a piece of paper. "Captain," he said, "telegram from the outpost at Rio Verde." Sterling took the paper. He read it. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. "Well," he said, "it seems your information was incorrect. Miss Hayes, or perhaps your friends got lost." He tossed the paper onto the desk in front of her. "Patrol caught a group of hostiles trying to cross the river 10 miles south of here," Sterling said. "Fight was short. Most of them are dead, but they took 3 prisoners. One of them is a buck, badly shot up, matches the description of your captor." Clara felt the world tilt. The floor seemed to drop away beneath her chair. "No," she whispered. "They are bringing them in tomorrow," the judge said, wiping his spectacles. "We will hold a hearing at the fort. Save the territory the cost of a transport to Tucson. If he is the leader, we will hang him by the weekend." Clara looked at Edward. He was smiling. It was a small, satisfied smile, a victory smile. "He came back for you, didn't he?" Edward said softly. "The stupid savage came back." Clara stood up. The chair clattered backward. "He came back because he has a heart," she said, her voice rising, "which is more than any of you can say." "Sit down." "Clara," Edward barked. "Standing up." "No," Clara shouted. "I am done sitting down. I am done lying." She looked at the judge. "If you hang him, you hang an innocent man." The judge looked at her with mild interest. "Innocent? My dear, he is an Apache. His existence is a crime." Clara walked out of the office. Edward grabbed for her arm, but she slapped his hand away with a force that shocked them both. She stepped out into the blinding sunlight of the street. She stood there, breathing the dust, feeling the gazes of the townspeople. She felt sick. She felt terrified. But under the fear, there was something else. A fire. The same fire that had helped her climb the cliff face. The same fire that had kept her warm in the snow. She would not let Dasan die. She asked the blacksmith where she could find a lawyer. The man laughed and pointed to a ramshackle office above the saloon. Jonas Reed was not a successful man. His office was a testament to failure. Stacks of dusty books, a spittoon that hadn't been emptied in a week, and a bottle of rye whiskey on the desk that was half empty at 10 in the morning. He looked up when Clara entered. He had a face like a bloodhound, sad and drooping, with eyes that had seen too much injustice to hold any hope. "I don't have any money," Clara said, standing in the doorway. Jonas sighed. He poured a shot of whiskey and drank it. "Then you are in the wrong office." "Miss, the Charity Aid Society is down the street." "I don't want charity," Clara said. "I want justice." Jonas laughed, a dry, rasping sound. "Justice is a commodity, miss, like sugar or nails. You buy it. You don't get it for free, especially not here." "I'm Clara Hayes." Jonas stopped. He looked at her over the rim of his glass. He took in the gray dress, the sun-darkened skin, the defiant set of her jaw, the Indian girl. He muttered, "The town celebrity. I need you to represent Dasan, the Apache they captured." Jonas stared at her. Then he poured another drink. "Go home, girl. That man is dead already. They are measuring the rope. He is not a criminal." Clara stepped forward, slamming her hands on his desk. "He saved my life. He protected me. He is—" She stopped. She took a breath. "He is my husband." Jonas froze. He lowered the glass slowly. "Excuse me? I married him. In the canyon. It wasn't a church wedding, but it was real. I am his wife, and if they hang him, they hang my husband." She looked at the lawyer, her eyes burning with tears she refused to shed. "I have no money, Mr. Reed, but I can cook. I can clean this filth you call an office. I can write letters. I will work for you for 10 years if I have to. But you have to help me. You are the only one who doesn't look like you want to throw a stone at me." Jonas looked at her. He looked at the dust on her dress. He looked at the fire in her eyes. He remembered a time, 30 years ago, when he had believed in the law, when he had believed it was a shield, not a sword. He sighed. He capped the bottle. "You can start by sweeping the floor," he said gruffly. "It's filthy." The scandal broke the next morning. Clara did not hide. She walked from the gable house to the jail at the fort, carrying a bucket of water and a loaf of bread she had stolen from the pantry. Edward intercepted her on the boardwalk. He was purple with rage. "What is this?" he hissed, grabbing her arm. "People are saying you went to that drunkard Reed. They are saying you called yourself that name." Clara pulled her arm free. She looked at him, and for the first time, she saw him not as a monster, but as a small, pathetic man. "I told the truth. Edward, I am Dasan's wife." "You are a whore," Edward shouted. The veneer of the gentleman cracked. Passers-by stopped to watch. "You are a soiled, dirty whore who lay with a dog. I tried to save you. I tried to cover your shame. You tried to own me," Clara shouted back. "You don't care about my shame. You care about your property value. Well, the property is gone. Edward, I belong to myself, and I choose him." She walked past him. Edward stood there, shaking, his face twisted in hate. "I will ruin you," he screamed after her. "I will make sure you starve in the gutter." The hearing was held in the mess hall of the fort. It was a cavernous room smelling of cabbage and boiled coffee. Tables were pushed together to form a bench. Judge Holloway sat in the center, flanked by Captain Sterling. The room was packed, miners, soldiers. ladies in bonnets. They all crowded in to see the show. Then they brought the prisoners in. There were 3 of them, 2 young warriors Clara recognized. And then Dasan. He was in chains. Heavy iron shackles bound his wrists and ankles. He moved slowly, limping heavily. His shoulder was bandaged with a dirty rag, dark with fresh blood. His face was gaunt, bruised from a rifle butt. But his eyes were clear. He looked up. He scanned the room. He found Clara in the front row, sitting next to Jonas Reed. He did not smile. He simply looked at her. In that look, there was no accusation, only relief. She was alive. Clara felt a sob rise in her throat, but she swallowed it down. She reached out and rested her hand on the table, wishing she could touch him. The prosecutor, a slick man from Tucson, began. He painted a picture of monsters. He spoke of raids, of scalps, of the inherent savagery of the Apache race. He called Dasan a mad dog who needed to be put down for the safety of white women everywhere. Jonas Reed stood up. He looked tired. His suit was threadbare. I called Clara Hayes to the stand. He said. A murmur went through the room. Edward, sitting in the back, crossed his arms, his eyes narrowing. Clara walked to the witness chair. She sat down. She looked at the judge. Miss Hayes, Jonas said, you were with this band for 4 months? Did the prisoner, Dasan, ever harm you? No, Clara said clearly. Did he force himself upon you? No. Tell the court what he did do. Clara looked at the crowd. He fed me when his own people were starving. She said, he carried me when I could not walk. He taught me how to find water. He protected me from men, from white men, who wanted to hurt me. She looked at Edward. He is not the savage, she said, her voice ringing in the silence. The savagery is here. It is in this town. It is in the way you look at him. Objection, the prosecutor shouted. The witness is suffering from Stockholm Syndrome. She is infatuated with her captor. I'm in love with my husband, Clara shouted back. The room exploded. The judge banged his gavel. Silence, silence, or I will clear the court. Edward stood up. He could not help himself. His ego, bruised and bleeding, took control. She is lying, he screamed, pointing a trembling finger at Clara. She is mad. I should have left her in the desert. He walked toward the front of the room, his face red. I spent $500 to get her back. I hired the trackers. I told the soldiers exactly where that wagon would be. The room went deadly quiet. Jonas Reed stepped forward. He looked at Edward. Excuse me, Mr. Mallory? Jonas said softly. You told the soldiers where the wagon would be? Which wagon? The wagon she was in, Edward snapped. The one that was ambushed. Jonas smiled. It was a wolfish, predatory smile. But, Mr. Mallory, the ambush happened 50 miles off the main road, a shortcut. How did you know they would take that shortcut? Unless... Edward stopped. He looked around the room. He saw the confusion on the faces of the soldiers. He saw the suspicion in the judge's eyes. He realized what he had said. I meant the rescue. He stammered. You meant that you set it up. Clara said, standing up. She looked at him with absolute clarity. You hired the bandits, didn't you? You wanted the wagon attacked. Why? For the insurance? Or because I told you I wouldn't marry you, and you wanted to be rid of a difficult fiancé without losing face? Edward went pale. That is preposterous, he whispered. Is it? Jonas asked the judge. Perhaps we should check Mr. Mallory's bank records? Perhaps we should find that traitor, Silas Grimm, and ask him who paid him to lead the soldiers to the canyon? The judge looked at Edward. He looked at the angry murmur starting to rise in the crowd. The narrative was shifting. The hero was looking like a villain. Sit down. Mr. Mallory, the judge said coldly. You will remain in town until this is clarified. But what about the Apache? Captain Sterling demanded. This changes nothing about him. He is still a renegade. He still fought the army. The judge looked at Dasan. He looked at Clara. He was a man of the law, but he was also a politician. He could not hang the husband of the victim without a riot, but he could not free an Apache warrior without losing his job. I will postpone sentencing, the judge said. The prisoner will be remanded to the fort stockade pending a review of the evidence. He banged the gavel. Court is adjourned. The guards grabbed Hassan. They hauled him up. As they dragged him past Clara, he leaned in. Use both hands, he whispered. Then he was gone, swallowed by the sea of blue uniforms. That night, Clara sat in Jonas Reed's office. The oil lamp sputtered on the desk. It won't work, Jonas said. He poured a drink, but he didn't drink it. He just stared at the amber liquid. What do you mean? Clara asked. We exposed Edward. The judge knows Edward is a scoundrel, Jonas said. But that doesn't make Hassan a citizen. It doesn't make him free. They will transfer him to the federal prison in Yuma or Florida. He will die in a cell. Clara, the law is a machine. It doesn't know how to stop once it starts grinding. Clara looked out the window at the dark street. She saw the silhouette of the fort against the stars. Then we stopped the machine. She said. Jonas looked at her. You are talking about a jailbreak. Clara, that is a hanging offense. I am already ruined. Jonas. They call me a whore. They call me a traitor. What is one more name on the list? She turned to him. Her face was set in lines of determination that made her look 10 years older than she was. They are moving him tomorrow morning. At dawn, before the town wakes up. The transfer wagon. Jonas ran a hand over his tired face. He looked at the whiskey bottle. He looked at the girl who had more courage in her little finger than the entire town of Silver City. He pushed the bottle away. I know a spot, he said quietly. 5 miles out. The road narrows between 2 bluffs. Clara leaned forward. Tell me what we need. Jonas sighed. He opened his desk drawer and pulled out an old Navy Colt revolver. He placed it on the desk. We need a wagon, he said. We need a distraction. And we need a miracle. I don't believe in miracles anymore, Clara said, picking up the heavy gun. It felt cold and dead in her hand. I believe in us. She spun the cylinder. It clicked, a sound like a clock ticking down the seconds of their lives. Let's go get my husband. The dawn arrived not with the promise of warmth, but with a gray, suffocating light that pressed down on the fort like a lead blanket. The air smelled of wet wool, manure, and the sharp, coppery tang of impending violence. Inside the stockade, the transfer had begun. It was a grim procession. 12 Apache prisoners, their ankles chafed raw by iron shackles, were being loaded onto 2 flatbed wagons. They moved with the stiffness of men who had slept on stone floors, their breath pluming in the freezing air. Hassan was in the second wagon. He sat near the back, his wrists bound with heavy manacles that were chained to a central iron ring bolted to the wagon bed. He looked thinner than he had in the canyon. His cheekbones cut sharp angles against his skin, and the bruise on his jaw from a rifle butt had turned a sickly yellow. But his eyes were alive. They scanned the perimeter, the height of the walls, the number of guards, calculating odds that he knew were 0. A sergeant with a red mustache spat tobacco juice near Hassan's boot. Enjoy the ride. Buck, the sergeant said, grinning. They say the Florida swamps are nice this time of year. If the fever doesn't get you, the gators will. The soldiers standing guard laughed. It was a nervous, hollow sound. They were joking about the show back east, about the civilized world where Indians were curiosities in cages rather than terrors in the night. But their hands stayed close to their holsters. They knew that a caged wolf was still a wolf. The heavy wooden gates of the fort groaned open. The convoy moved out, 4 mounted troopers in the lead, followed by the 2 prisoner wagons, with 6 more troopers bringing up the rear. Hassan did not look back at the fort. He looked at the road stretching out toward the horizon, a ribbon of rutted mud cutting through the desolate scrub. He thought of Clara. He hoped she was far away by now. He hoped she was on a train to St. Louis or Boston, somewhere with paved streets and no memories of the desert wind. He closed his eyes and tried to summon her face, using it as a shield against the despair that threatened to swallow him. 5 miles down the road, the landscape shifted. The open plain gave way to a series of low, rocky bluffs that crowded the trail, creating a narrow defile where the wind whistled with a lonely, mournful sound. Clara Hayes was waiting there. She was crouched behind a boulder on the ridge, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she thought it might crack the bone. She wore a shapeless coat she had bought from a miner and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low. In her hand, she clutched a heavy canvas sack. Below her, on the road, Jonas Reed sat on the bench of a battered supply wagon. Beside him sat Elias, the town blacksmith, a man whose forearms were as thick as tree trunks and who owed Jonas a life debt for keeping his son out of prison 3 years ago. Hidden in the brush on the opposite side of the road was Mateo, a vaquero who had ridden with Taza's father and had no love for the blue coats. "This is madness," Elias muttered, chewing on a matchstick. "We are going to die." "Jonas!" Jonas took a pull from his flask. His hands were shaking, but his eyes were clear. "We are already dead men. Elias, this is just the paperwork." He saw the dust cloud approaching. "Get ready," Jonas said. He snapped the reins. The wagon lurched forward, blocking the narrow road completely. Jonas pulled hard to the left, driving the front wheel into a deep ditch. The wagon slammed to a halt, listing dangerously to one side. "Hey!" Jonas shouted, standing up and waving his hat. "Help! The axle is gone!" The military convoy rounded the bend and ground to a halt. The lead lieutenant, a young man with a clean uniform and no patience, rode forward. "Move that junk, you drunkard!" the lieutenant shouted. "You are blocking a federal transfer! I can't move it!" Jonas wailed, playing the part of the incompetent fool. "The wheel is jammed! I have dynamite in the back! It is unstable!" The mention of dynamite made the soldiers pull their horses back. Confusion rippled through the line. Clara watched from the ridge. She saw the second wagon stop. She saw the dark head of the man sitting in the back. "Now," she whispered. Mateo, across the canyon, fired a single shot into the air. At the same moment, he slapped the rump of the lead wagon's team. The horses panicked. They reared, screaming, and surged forward, crashing into Jonas's wagon. Wood splintered. Dust exploded into the air, thick and choking. "It is an ambush!" a soldier screamed. Gunfire erupted. It was chaotic, undirected. Men firing at shadows in the dust. Clara moved. She did not run away. She ran into the hell. She slid down the shale slope, dust billowing around her, and sprinted toward the second wagon. Dasan saw a figure emerge from the cloud. At first, he thought it was a spirit. Then he saw the gray eyes. "Clara," he breathed, the word lost in the roar of a shotgun. She reached the wagon. She scrambled up the wheel, ignoring the splinters tearing at her dress. She pulled a heavy iron key from her pocket, a key Jonas had bribed from a corrupt jailer the night before with the last of his savings. She fumbled with the lock on the central ring. Her hands were shaking violently. "Hurry," Dasan hissed. He did not look at her. He looked at the soldier aiming a carbine at them from the ground. Clara jammed the key in. She twisted. The mechanism groaned and clicked. The chain fell loose. Dasan moved with the speed of a striking snake. He didn't wait to be unshackled from his wrists. He swung the heavy chain like a flail, striking the soldier who was climbing onto the wagon. The man went down with a crunch of bone. "Run!" Clara screamed. She grabbed his arm. They jumped from the wagon together, landing in the dirt. Dasan grabbed a rifle from the fallen soldier. He fired twice, covering their retreat. "Go for the rocks!" Jonas shouted from behind the overturned wagon. Clara turned to look. Jonas was standing up, firing his Navy Colt, drawing the fire of 3 soldiers to give them a clear path. "Jonas, no!" she screamed. A bullet caught Jonas in the chest. He jerked back, the flask flying from his hand. He slumped against the wagon wheel, a small red stain spreading on his dusty vest. He looked at Clara across the chaos. He smiled, a sad, weary smile, and waved her away. "Go," he mouthed. Elias the blacksmith roared, tackling a trooper who was aiming at Clara. Mateo rode out of the brush, driving a herd of loose horses through the convoy, adding to the bedlam. Dasan grabbed Clara's hand. He did not let her look back. He hauled her toward the rocky slope. "Move! Clara, move your feet!" They scrambled up the defile. Bullets kicked up sprays of rock shards around them. A zing of lead tore through Clara's sleeve, burning her skin, but she didn't stop. They reached the crest of the ridge and dropped down into a gully on the other side. They ran until their lungs burned and their legs felt like wood. Behind them, the sounds of the battle faded, replaced by the shouts of pursuit. "They are coming," Dasan gasped, pulling her up a steep incline of loose scree. "They will have trackers." They moved deeper into the mountains. The terrain was brutal, jagged granite that sliced through Clara's shoes, thorny brush that whipped their faces. One of the other Apache prisoners, a boy named Hami who had escaped with them, stumbled and fell. A shot cracked from the ridge behind them. Hami went still. "Don't stop," Dasan ordered, his voice flat. They climbed for hours. The sky began to darken, not with night, but with heavy, leaden clouds. The temperature plummeted. Then the snow began. It started as a few stinging flakes, then thickened into a white curtain that blotted out the world. The wind howled, erasing their footprints seconds after they made them. "It is the ghost dance," Dasan shouted over the wind. "The spirits are hiding us. The storm was a mercy and a curse. It blinded their pursuers, but it threatened to freeze the blood in their veins." They stumbled blindly, unable to see more than 5 feet ahead. Clara fell. She lay in the snow, the cold seeping into her bones. "I can't," she whispered. "Jonas, he died. He died for me." Dasan knelt beside her. He hauled her up. He wrapped his arms around her, sharing what little heat he had. "He died so you would live," Dasan said fiercely into her ear. "Do not insult his gift by dying in a snowbank. Walk, Clara. Use both hands." They found a shallow cave as night fell, a depression in the rock face protected by an overhang. They collapsed inside, out of the biting wind. It was freezing dark. Clara's fingers were too numb to work the matches she had in her bundle. Dasan took them from her. He managed to light a small fire using dry moss and twigs from a rat's nest in the corner. The tiny flame cast long, dancing shadows. Clara looked at Dasan. He was shivering. The wound on his shoulder had reopened, bleeding through the dirty bandage. His wrists were raw and bloody where the manacles still hung. The chain broken, but the iron cuffs locked tight. Clara took the knife from her belt. "Let me," she whispered. She cut strips from her petticoat. She cleaned his wrists with snow. She bound his shoulder. He watched her face. He saw the tracks of tears freezing on her cheeks. "You came back," he said softly. The words were full of wonder. "I told you," she said, her voice trembling. "I am your wife." He reached out and touched her face. His hand was cold, but his touch burned. "I thought I would never see you again," he confessed. When the wagon started moving, I looked at the sky and I asked it to kill me. Clara leaned forward. She pressed her forehead against his chest. "I was so afraid. Dasan, I was afraid I wasn't enough. I was afraid I couldn't save you." "You saved me," he whispered. "You saved us all." They huddled together under the single blanket Clara had brought. The fire died down, but they did not pull apart. They clung to each other like shipwrecked survivors on a raft, their bodies pressed together for warmth, for reassurance, for the simple proof that they were still solid matter in a world of ghosts. They whispered into the dark. They apologized for the things they had said in anger. They confessed the doubts that had gnawed at them in the long nights apart. "I love you," Clara whispered. "More than my life. More than my soul. I am your soul," Dasan answered, "and you are mine." They slept in shifts, listening to the wind howl outside, safe in the small, fragile bubble of their togetherness. The next morning, the world was white. The snow had covered everything, the blood, the tracks, the past. They moved on, guided by Dasan's memory of the old trails. They went deeper into the mountains than the soldiers dared to go. They crossed icy streams that numbed their legs to the bone. They climbed ridges where the air was so thin it made them dizzy. They walked until the boots fell off Clara's feet and she wrapped them in rabbit skins they trapped. They found a valley. It was not on any map. It was a cup of green tucked between three towering peaks, fed by a spring that never froze. There was a lake, deep and still, reflecting the sky. There were deer. There was timber. "We stop here," Dasan said. "Time is a river." In the settlements, it flows in hours and minutes, measured by clocks and train schedules. In the mountains, it flows in seasons, the greening of the aspens, the running of the salmon, the first frost, the deep snow. Months turned into a year. Then, too, the valley changed. It was no longer empty. Word travels in the high country, carried by the wind and the desperate. Others found the valley, a family of runaways from the San Carlos reservation, their eyes haunted by hunger. A Mexican family fleeing the rurales, led by a matriarch named Elena who could cook beans that tasted like heaven. A black couple, Samuel and Sarah, who had walked all the way from Texas to find a place where no one would look at the color of their skin before looking at their hearts. It was a ragtag community of the unwanted. They spoke a mix of Apache, Spanish, and English. They had no laws but one: you help or you leave. Clara and Dasan built a cabin near the lake. It was not a grand house. It was built of hand-hewn pine logs, chinked with mud and moss. It had a stone chimney that drew well and a roof that didn't leak. Clara learned to grind acorns into flour. She learned to tan hides until they were soft as velvet. She learned to speak the language of the mountains, the guttural, singing words of the Apache. Dasan learned to plow. He learned to fix a wagon wheel. He learned the lullabies Clara hummed while she worked, songs about rivers in Virginia and Shenandoah valleys he would never see. They were not safe. Not truly. Safety is an illusion. They heard rumors from the occasional trader who ventured up the secret trails. They heard that their names were still on wanted posters in Silver City. They heard that Edward Mallory had drunk himself to death in a Tucson saloon, ranting about the savage who stole his life. They heard that the army still sent patrols out sometimes, looking for the lost band, but the thunder was distant. One evening in late autumn, the valley was painted in gold. The aspens were turning, quaking in the breeze like thousands of gold coins. The sun was setting, casting long purple shadows across the lake. Clara stood outside the cabin. She was wearing a dress of soft buckskin, embroidered with beads she had traded for. Her hair was loose, blowing in the wind. She rested her hand on her stomach. It was a small, round curve. Fear flickered in her eyes. It was the old fear. The fear of the mother wolf who knows the hunters are still in the woods. Dasan came up behind her. He had filled out. The gauntness of the prison wagon was gone, replaced by the lean, hard muscle of a man who worked the land. He wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. He rested his chin on the top of her head. "What do you see?" he asked softly. "I see the winter coming," Clara said. "I see the snow. And what else? I see a world that hates us. Dasan, I see a child who will be half you and half me, and I wonder if there is a place for him." Dasan turned her around. He looked into her face. The lines around his eyes had deepened, crinkled by the sun and by laughter. But his gaze was as fierce as the day he had pulled her from the wagon. "We do not ask the world for a place, Clara. We make it." He placed his large, warm hand over hers on her stomach. "He will know the mountains. He will know the stories of your people and mine. He will know that he was born of a love that defeated an army. That is enough." Clara looked at him. She saw the scar on his shoulder, the gray starting to touch his temples. She saw the man who was her anchor. "Yes," she whispered. "That is enough." That night, the wind picked up, singing through the pines with the voice of the coming winter. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled, casting a warm, orange glow on the log walls. They lay in the bed they had built together, under a pile of furs. Their lovemaking was not the desperate, frantic collision of their early days. It was slow. It was deep. It was a language they had perfected over 1,000 nights. Dasan moved over her, his weight familiar and grounding. He kissed the hollow of her throat, the scar on her wrist from the climb, the curve of her belly. Clara held him, her hands tracing the muscles of his back, her fingers tangling in his dark hair. There were no words. There was only the sound of their breathing and the crackle of the fire. It was a celebration of scars. It was a testament to the fact that they had been broken and put back together, stronger than before. It was a stubborn, defiant joy that refused to be extinguished by the darkness outside. When it was over, they lay tangled together, listening to the wind. "Did you hear that?" Clara whispered. "What?" "Riders." Dasan listened. He heard the wind. He heard the hoot of an owl. He heard the distant cry of a coyote. "It is just the wind," he said. "But even if it isn't," Clara said, squeezing his hand, "even if they come—" Dasan squeezed back. His grip was iron. "We are here," he said. "We stand." "We stand," she echoed. They lay awake as the fire died down to embers, two hearts beating in the vast, wild silence of the high country. The dawn came slowly. It touched the peaks first, turning the snow to fire. Then it crept down the slopes, lighting the gold of the aspens, the blue of the lake, the rough timber of the cabin. Clara and Dasan stood in the doorway. He had his arm around her shoulders. She had her arm around his waist. They were barefoot. The earth was cold beneath their feet, but the sun on their faces was warm. They looked out at the valley. They looked at the smoke rising from the chimneys of their neighbors. They looked at the trail winding up toward the pass, the trail that led back to the world that had tried to destroy them. The future was uncertain. The winter would be hard. The soldiers might come. But as the sun crested the ridge, flooding the valley with light, Clara leaned her head against Dasan's shoulder. She felt the strength of him, solid as the mountain itself. She used both hands to hold on to him, and she knew, with a certainty that went deeper than bone, that they would face it all, together. Thank you for listening to this story of Clara and Dasan. It has been a journey through the dust, the snow, and the resilience of the human heart. I would love to know where you are listening from. Please leave a comment below and share your location. If this story moved you, please subscribe to From Wild West for more tales of love and survival on the frontier. I look forward to reading your thoughts and seeing you in the next story. Goodbye for now.